Among the many plague cities in history, Venice may have been the most unusual. Other cities tried to close their gates, drive away the sick, or pray to God. But Venice did something colder and more mysterious. It sent fear into the lagoon and locked the unknown plague on an island. In 1423, during a plague crisis, the Venetian Senate decided to establish an isolation site on the island of Santa Maria di Nazareth to receive people infected with plague. Later, Venice created another quarantine island to deal with ships, goods, and travelers arriving from the sea. These islands were not ordinary administrative facilities. Time became the judge, distance became protection, water became the boundary. Quarantine was never just a cold system. It carried an ancient, almost ritual feeling. 40 days, 40 giorni, the period later connected with the word quarantine, was not only about waiting for symptoms to appear. To people of that age, 40 days carried a heavy religious meaning. A person, or a ship, was forced to wait 40 days. You had not been sentenced to death, but you were not yet allowed back among the living. You were suspended in between, looking across the water at the city, waiting for time to prove whether you belonged on the safe side. To Venice, the quarantine island was policy. To those sent there, it could feel like exile. They could see the distant bell towers. They could imagine people still trading, praying, and living inside the city. But they themselves were held beyond a line of water. The most painful thing was that they may have done nothing wrong. They may not even have been sick. They may simply have come from a suspected port. But in an age of plague, innocence was not the same as safety. Danger could be invisible, and suspicion was enough to change a person's fate. The quarantine island therefore became one of Venice's most contradictory places. Every morning before the fog had lifted from the lagoon, the waiting had already begun. In the distance, Venice looked like a vision close enough to touch but impossible to reach. Bell towers rose through the mist, and by the time their sound crossed the water, it had become faint, like a voice from another world. Those sent to the island woke under that sound, counting how many days remained, wondering whether anyone in the city still remembered them. Some were sailors. Some were merchants. Some were porters who had followed the cargo. Some had merely passed through a place that had become suspicious. For them, the most tormenting thing was not immediate death, but uncertainty. They did not know whether they were safe, dangerous, or already quietly abandoned by the city. When ships arrived, the atmosphere on the island tightened at once. Guards recorded where they had come from. Officials checked the cargo. Sailors were questioned. Boxes, bundles, barrels, and luggage were carried off the ships. No one knew where the true danger was hiding, so everything seemed to carry a secret. Damp ropes, sealed crates, clothes worn through long voyages, letters from distant ports, all of them could make people uneasy. Plague here was not a clear enemy stepping into the open. It was more like a formless shadow. It did not speak. It did not admit that it existed. Yet it made everyone move around it. The less people could see it, the more they felt it everywhere. It hid inside waiting, inside silence, inside the records written by officials, and inside every gaze that could not yet enter Venice. By day, the island was busy. Goods were moved. Records were counted. Entrances were watched. The sick were cared for. Others waited to be examined. But this kind of busyness was completely different from the busyness of the city. In Venice, busyness meant trade, profit, news, and life. On the island, busyness always circled one question: was death hidden here? A shipment was placed aside, aired out, and inspected. A ship was forced to remain. A person was told to keep waiting. None of these actions looked dramatic by themselves, but together, they felt like a trial with no spoken verdict. Every passing day, time watched these people and objects on behalf of the city. Who would return? Who would fall ill? Who would vanish? Who would be written down? Who would be buried on the island? None of those answers appeared at once. They slowly revealed themselves through waiting. Night was worse. During the day, commands and tasks could press fear down. But at night, when the lagoon grew quiet, when the water touched the shore softly, when the lights of Venice flickered in the distance, People on the island understood more clearly where they had been placed. The city had not completely abandoned them, but it had not allowed them back either. They were suspended between two fates. On one side was Venice, still breathing. On the other was death, perhaps already drawing near. Perhaps someone prayed in the dark. Perhaps someone heard the distant bell and thought of family. Perhaps someone repeated to himself that after 40 days, everything would end. But in an age of plague, waiting was never empty. Waiting itself was part of the fear. The deepest meaning of the quarantine island formed through this day after day of waiting. It was not simply an island for imprisoning the sick. It was an island built to deal with uncertainty. Sometimes what changed a person's fate was not illness itself, but suspicion. If you came from a certain port, if you had sailed on a certain ship, if you had touched a certain cargo, you might be held outside the city. Venice used this system to protect itself, but it also turned uncertainty itself into a kind of identity. You were not sick, but you could not move like the healthy. You were not guilty, but you had to endure a waiting that felt like judgment. You were still alive, but already removed from the life of the city. That state was more oppressive than simple isolation, because it took away not only freedom of movement, but the right to explain your own fate. The mass graves later discovered on the old quarantine island made its shadow even more concrete. Those graves remind us that this is not an abstract history of policy. Real people once waited there, fell ill there, died far from their families, and were buried in ground without city streets or loved ones beside them. They may once have seen Venice across the water, heard its bells, imagined they would return, and yet remained on the island forever. To the city, those deaths had been pushed away. To the dead, that island became their last world. So the phrase sea graveyard is not only an image. It describes a real kind of place, an island that was part hospital, part harbor checkpoint, part burial ground, and part of the city's conscience that Venice could not look at directly. Venice's greatness becomes especially clear inside this contradiction. It had to remain open to the world, or it would lose trade, wealth, and influence. But it also had to suspect the world, or plague might follow the sea routes into the center of the city. It could not simply close its doors like an inland town, because Venice's door was the sea itself. Ships were life and ships were danger. Arrival was hope and arrival was threat. The quarantine island was Venice's answer to this contradiction. It did not stop receiving the world, but it made the world wait in the middle of the water. It did not deny fear, but transformed fear into procedures, records, guards, and time. It did not abandon faith completely, but it did not simply wait for God to act. This is what made Venice more complex than many cities. It was practical and devout, shrewd and afraid. It used systems while still believing that disaster might carry sacred meaning. In the eyes of this city, plague was never merely a management problem. Venice deeply believed in its relationship with St. Mark, with its churches and with public vows. When plague threatened the city, officials could issue orders, ships could be stopped, and the sick could be isolated. But the city would still ask, why has death come near again? Why would a place protected by a saint still hear plague knocking? Why could prayer not immediately push disaster away? These questions gave Venice's plague history a heavy religious pressure. The quarantine island dealt with visible danger. The church dealt with invisible fear. One sent people into the middle of the water. The other lifted the soul of the city toward heaven. After the plague of 1575 to 1577, Venice built the Church of the Redentore as an act of gratitude for deliverance. After another great plague in 1630 to 1631, Venice built the Church of Santa Maria della Salute. These were not ordinary memorial buildings. They were stone vows written to God. Every stone seemed to admit that human beings could build islands, arrange guards, make ships wait, and record death, but still could not fully control fate. Venice needed systems, but it also needed mercy. It needed the distance of water, and it needed an answer from heaven. This is where the story of Venice becomes truly powerful. It is not a story of a city defeating plague. It is a story of a city negotiating again and again with an invisible disaster. The quarantine island made Venice look calm. The church vows exposed its fear. It held people beyond the water and begged God to forgive the city. It sent possible death to an island and then built magnificent churches inside the city to remember that it had once been spared. Reason and faith were not opposites here. They were the two hands Venice stretched out toward fear. One hand drew the boundary, the other reached toward heaven. But even the strictest boundary could not free Venice from plague completely. History proved that plague would return again and again. Rules could buy time. Islands could create distance. Guards could control movement. Vows could give fear a place to rest. But nothing could cancel death completely. The quarantine island was not the endpoint of victory. It was only one method inside Venice's long fear. It allowed the city to keep living, but it could not make the city permanently safe. Whenever a new danger approached from the sea, the old questions returned. Who should be allowed in? Who should wait? What should be trusted? What should be suspected? Where should fear be placed? This is also the cruelest question raised by the quarantine island. When a city draws a boundary to protect itself, how does it see the people on the other side? Are they protected or exiled? Are they waiting to return, or have they already been removed from the city's memory for a time? Quarantine can save many people, but it can also leave some people to carry fear alone. It can keep the city functioning while pushing part of its pain out of sight. Venice locked the unknown plague on an island in the sea, but that island was never truly outside the city. It was Venice's own shadow. The waiting on the island belonged to Venice. The silence on the island belonged to Venice. The dead on the island belonged to Venice. The city simply needed a stretch of water between itself and that fear, so it could continue believing that order still existed. Later, as the shadow of plague slowly withdrew, Venice welcomed ships, goods, and crowds again. But the island never truly returned to the ordinary world. It was later turned to other uses, then fell into silence and decay. Like a memory the city had temporarily set down. Only when modern archaeology reopened that ground did people discover that the fear Venice had once sent into the lagoon had not disappeared. It was still buried there, transformed into mass graves, ruined buildings, and a silence the city could never completely forget. The quarantine island was no longer only the remains of a system. It had become the graveyard of Venice's plague memory. It seemed to remind every later generation that a city can push fear into the middle of the water, but it cannot remove fear from its own history. In the end, Venice's quarantine island became one of the most unforgettable symbols in plague history, not only because it represented an early system of isolation, and not only because it preserved traces of death, but because it revealed the deepest instinct of a city facing an unknown disaster. To put fear somewhere, to give it a boundary, a time, a guard, and a name, and then tell itself that the city can continue. But fear never truly disappeared. It was only placed in the middle of the water, surrounded by fog, watched by bells, and remembered by history. Venice did not merely build a quarantine island. It built a mirror floating on the sea. In that mirror, we can see the intelligence, fear, faith, cruelty, and helplessness of a city. It locked the unknown plague on an island, letting death wait across the water. But it also showed later generations something deeper. When a city faces an invisible disaster, the first thing it tries to protect is often not only life, but its own ability to keep believing in order. Subscribe to this channel, because history's darkest shadows are rarely gone. Most of them are only waiting to be read again.